Okay. Right. Hi, everyone. I am lecturing once again from the back porch at my in-laws' place. Can everyone see and hear me okay? Excellent. There's a dog you might also hear, but that's okay. He's just being a doggo. So, um, so might be a bit sluggish today. I was actually up quite late. I didn't intend to be, but I saw some very cool stuff happening in the sky last night. And if you're curious, um, just check out the Discord server. Although maybe some of you also were fortunate enough to be up last night. Well, it was the Northern Lights. Yeah. It was after midnight, and I got a notification on my phone because I have that little app that tells you when the KP index reaches a certain threshold where you can see the lights in your area. So, and then I spent the next, um, well, I kind of lost track of time, but I spent the next little while running around the neighborhood grabbing shots with my phone. And it was quite cool. Probably almost as bright as during the solar storm earlier this year. So very fortunate that I was just in the right place in the right time. So now that we're sharing the screen, oh, did any of you happen to catch a light show wherever you are last night? Ah, disappointing. Yeah. Oh yeah, Jake, that's right. It is the Perseid? Yeah, it's the Perseid meteor shower. Um Jill, yeah. You probably did see one. Because yeah, the Perseid meteor shower occurs when the Earth passes through a debris trail um left by a comet. So every year, as we orbit the sun, we pass through this cloud of debris and we get a whole bunch of shooting stars. Yeah, it happens around this time every year. Um, yeah, Jake had the foreknowledge, so he was prepared. I think I might have caught a couple shooting stars in my images of the lights, but they don't show up very well, and it was very difficult to keep my phone still. So, but yeah, so apologies if I'm a little sleepy today. Today, I want to talk about Canadian cryptozoology, and we'll be briefly kicking things off with some discussion of what cryptozoology is, and a look at one example from Canada, and then a look at another example from Canada, which kind of blew up. It went international, and that is, of course, Sasquatch or Bigfoot. So today I'm using chapter 2 from Loxton and Prothero's book, Abominable Science. And by the way, if you're thinking of writing your final essay on cryptozoology, I have not evaluated all of the proposals yet, but I will have that done for Wednesday or Thursday. So for right around the end of class. So if you're writing on cryptozoology, this book is a very good resource that I encourage you to take advantage of. And of course, it's available in digital form from the Carleton University Library, so you can access it for free. Um, but what does cryptozoology mean? As the authors tell us, this term comes from two ancient Greek words: cryptos, which means hidden, right? That cryptos is the same root. Um, it's the root shared by like cryptic, encryption, right? Or a crypt where your body is stored, right? You're hidden. And of course, zoos, which means life. So cryptozoology means the study of hidden animals. But there is some ambiguity about what a cryptid is, even amongst cryptozoologists. So um, there's discussion within that. I'm hesitant to call it a field, a proper scientific field. But there is discussion amongst cryptozoologists and amongst biologists, biologists, what exactly it means to be a cryptid. But we all have ideas of these creatures which are said to exist. Um, we've seen examples of them probably throughout our lives as we've grown up. If you're like me, you're probably familiar with stories of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness monster, right? These are you read about these in books when you're a kid. Unsolved mysteries, mysterious tales, these kinds of things, right? But of course, there are other examples of cryptids from all over the world, right? Usually, we could have one of two things in mind um, when we think of a cryptid, of a hidden animal. The big one for me, um, number one, are creatures that appear in folklore. So, Sasquatch, the Loch Ness monster, certainly part of folklore. Um, Initially, just local folklore, and then they each of those would go on to gain sort of international renown, as would creatures like the Wendigo or the Chupacabra, right? These are drawn from folkloric traditions in different places. Yeah, mermaids. Well, mermaids are interesting because um, they are, in the one sense, they're drawn from myth, right? So you have tales of mermaids and mermen in like ancient Greek myths, for example. But then, of course, there's a folkloric aspect that probably came from, and even well into the age of exploration, um, people would claim to have seen mermaids and mermen when, in fact, they were probably manatees, dugongs, whales, these kinds of things, right? Um, well, yeah, the Thunderbird, I nobody see why isn't the Thunderbird thought of as a cryptid? Well, because no one's going looking for it, right? No one goes out and expects to find one. Um, so likewise with gnomes, as Thomas says, like these are folkloric creatures like gnomes, elves, trolls, ogres, right? These all come from European, specifically Germanic folklore. But nobody's going out expecting to find one, right? So we don't regard them as cryptids. But sometimes a creature from folklore, some believe, um, is actually out there, as in the case of Sasquatch or the Loch Ness monster. And that's when you've got yourself a cryptid. Yeah, like Ogopogo, right? No one goes out trying to find a thunderbird, but people do go to Lake Okanagan to catch a glimpse of the Ogopogo, right? Oh, what is the Ogopogo? We will get to that. That's our first example of a Canadian cryptid. So we have creatures that appear in folklore, but as our discussion shows us so far, not every creature from folklore is a cryptid simply because cryptozoologists aren't necessarily looking for, I don't know, trolls, right? Although in Iceland, um, there are little people do craft little elf houses, and it's a little bit of local folklore. And I think as like we'll see with the mythology surrounding Sasquatch and Bigfoot, um, there's a certain level of I think the Icelanders are having tourists on, like, oh yeah, that's where the elves live. Oh, we totally believe in elves. Get a load of this guy who thinks we believe in elves, kind of thing, right? But yeah, um, nobody's going out there looking for trolls and dwarves and thunderbirds, but people are looking for Sasquatches and chupacabras and so forth, right? So that's one way you can think of a cryptid is a creature from folklore, which cryptozoologists believe is a real animal out there and which may have inspired um, the folklore themselves. I suppose the difference is, if you say you've seen something like a mermaid, you can explain that naturalistically easily enough by saying, "Oh, you cited some kind of other aquatic mammal like a manatee or a dugong, right?" Um, if no one's going to go out there and find a being that's half human and half fish, right? Um, but it is believed that we could go out there and find, oh, believed by some cryptozoologists, that you could go out there and find a large, hairy bipedal ape called Bigfoot, right? Um, oh, interesting, Yennefer. Yeah. Fairies are interesting because, well, they come out of the sort of like uh, the Celtic side of things. Um, and one of the earliest hoaxes done with photography um, are the images of the Cottingley fairies, which are basically just tiny little figurines that a photographer posed around a garden, took pictures of them, and said, "Hey, I've discovered that fairies are real." And you can look this up. People were taken in by this. None other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, that paragon of rationality, believed in the Cottingley fairies. Um, so there you go. Then again, we should not let the image of Sherlock Holmes as the supremely reasonable character make us forget the fact that Conan Doyle was a spiritualist. He believed in a lot of the things that we've been critiquing and debunking in this course. Very interesting. But yeah, since you mentioned fairies, Yennefer, check out the Cottingley fairies, one of the earliest photography hoaxes. Um, so a cryptid could be a creature that appears in folklore that a cryptozoologist thinks is actually out there somewhere. Or what some people seem to mean by cryptid is an animal which is thought to be extinct, but which is not. So some claim that the Loch Ness monster, or Nessie, for example, is a pliosaur, which is a type of aquatic reptile. We usually lump them in with dinosaurs, but technically they are a different kind of creature. But I'm sure you've seen renderings of pliosaurs. They have a long neck and sort of sea turtle like flippers on their body, almost like like an apatosaurus had a baby with a sea turtle or something, right? And some claim that Nessie is in fact an extant pliosaur, which somehow survived the extinction of the other prehistoric reptiles like dinosaurs and pterosaurs and so on and so forth. Now, of course, we do actually occasionally rediscover creatures which were believed to have gone extinct, like the coelacanth. Yeah, the apatosaur or something similar in the Amazon, Yennefer. Yeah, I forget the name, but that is covered in one of the chapters of Loxton and Prothero's book. So if you're curious to learn more, um, great example. There's all kinds of cryptids discussed in that book, not just Bigfoot. We've got Nessie, this dinosaur-like creature. What else do we have? The Yeti, right? Which is kind of like the Eurasian counterpart of Bigfoot. Gumbaroo. I don't know the Gumbaroo. Is that Australian? It sounds kind of Australian. No? Okay. A bear that can blow up. Like he explodes or he becomes larger. Oh, okay, yeah. Um, that's interesting. It's kind of like a Pokemon sort of ability, isn't it? So, the coelacanth, for example, is a lobe-finned fish, which emerges in the fossil record quite a long time ago, like 400 million years ago. Now, complex life emerged on Earth 500 million years ago. So that's how old this thing is. There was single cell life longer than that, but complex life, we get we get a little bit later. So this first coelacanths emerge in the fossil record about 400 million years ago. And we thought that it went extinct around the time of the dinosaurs, maybe a little bit before the dinosaurs went extinct, the end of the Cretaceous period. So about 66 million years ago, until we caught one. A live coelacanth was actually caught off the coast of South Africa in the early 20th century. And then in the mid 20th century, a different specimen was caught around Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken. So here's an example of something like what some cryptozoologists claim Nessie is, a living fossil. Um, but in fact, it's incorrectly claimed that the coelacanth hasn't changed in all that time. It has. It has undergone some morphological changes and apparently some genetic changes based on what I was reading, like genomic changes, although I'm not sure how they know that. They must have some kind of well-preserved DNA from a specimen somewhere, I suppose. I'm not actually sure how that works, but what we call the coelacanth a cryptid, well, not really. It's another example of one of those things that, once we know about it, it just gets subsumed or resubsumed back into science, back into proper science, right? So I wouldn't call the coelacanth a cryptid. Here is the picture that I found. This is from Wikipedia, and you can see that the fish are quite strange looking. They have these weird loby fins, and they're closely related to lungfish, which are the fish that emerged from the oceans millions of years ago and evolved into creatures that dwelled on the land, like amphibians. Yeah, once you discover it and explain it, it's not a cryptid, right? Or well, you explain it and it ceases to be a cryptid, or what you thought was a cryptid turns out to be something else, as in the case of mermaids, or perhaps even when it comes to creatures like Sasquatch, bears, because it turns out, as we'll see, the purported range of Sasquatch in North America overlaps perfectly with that of the black bear. So, take from that what you will. Now, it's important to emphasize that cryptozoology is a pseudoscience. It's like parapsychology, ufology, and many of the other examples that we've looked at in this class. Now, pseudoscience, again, looks scientific to somebody who's not familiar with what science is and how it's practiced, but it's actually not very scientific. And so, what cryptozoology kind of suffers from in general are problems with the following. Um, and this is, again, the same can be said of astrology, of um, parapsychology, alternative medicine, all of this stuff we've looked at, and many other things that we haven't looked at. Um, Cryptozoology seems to have some problems when it comes to adhering to the principles of naturalism. In fact, it's mentioned in this chapter that Bigfoot specifically is claimed by some to have paranormal powers, like glowing eyes or access to a spacecraft. Some claim that Sasquatches are interdimensional beings, right? Um, and as with other varieties of pseudoscience, we also have a problem with a lack of skepticism. Later in the slides, and it's also linked on Brightspace, but there's a clip from uh, that show Finding Bigfoot on Animal Planet, which is absolutely hilarious if you haven't seen it. But there is not enough skepticism applied um, on this show. because it's a television show, right? It's for entertainment purposes. But these guys, the Bigfoot team, I forget their names. There's Mike Moneymaker and Bobo, and I forget the other two. But anyway, they go to a place and, hey, I saw a Bigfoot, and it's, oh, of course you did. Yeah. Well, let's go see if we can find it. And of course, they never do, right? So a lack of skepticism and a lack of evidence. Evidence is often questionable or lacking. We'll see that today as well. Problems with parsimony. So again, violating Occam's razor, right? And problems with falsifiability. Pseudosciences don't formulate claims which are potentially falsifiable. And that's actually how science works. Science does not prove things that are true. What science does is it attempts to falsify. And if you repeatedly fail to falsify, you can be reasonably confident that your hypothesis is correct. Okay, so now on to the cryptids themselves. So there are lots of cryptids that are alleged to live in different places in Canada, like Ogopogo. So it's claimed that Ogopogo lives in Okanagan Lake out on the west coast in British Columbia. And here's a sort of artistic representation from a park. Again, this image is from Wikipedia. And it's thought, if you peruse that article and other similar articles, that um, this creature originates from a folkloric being called the Naitaka, which was a spirit. And the local indigenous people who lived around Okanagan Lake believed in this spirit. So it's important to emphasize right off the bat, like here, this is a very good example of a cryptid drawn right out of folklore, because, Ogopogo, or what we call Ogopogo now, original Naitaka, was never supposed to be an animal. It was a spirit, right? It's kind of become appropriated and commercialized. So it's a tourist attraction now. And there are some people that claim that they have sighted Ogopogo. Have they really sighted an animal? Well, remember, the people that originally inhabited that area did not believe it was an animal. They believed it was a spirit. Um, so a non-physical being that could maybe take physical form, but it was a spirit, not an animal. Um, those who claim to have seen it have probably been looking at something else. Um, Floating debris is one possibility, but also otters swimming in train. So otters kind of swimming one after another might look a little bit like a giant serpentine creature swimming through the water. Um, so for some reason or another, which we'll get to later, Ogopogo never reached the levels of fame that Bigfoot did. Bigfoot was originally known as Sasquatch. Here's a promotional image from Finding Bigfoot. Sorry, I can't keep a straight face when I see this. Look at Bobo with his measuring tape and his evidence bag. Um, uh, Great. I'm kind of disappointed, right? Like because well, maybe I shouldn't be because obviously this crew had a lot of fun making this show, but in all the years it was on, they never found Bigfoot. Um, So I don't know why they call the show Finding Bigfoot, but they never find him. Spoiler alert. But anyway, Bigfoot is claimed to be this bipedal ape, very tall, usually at least 6 feet tall, oftentimes taller. And it's probably one of the most famous cryptids in the world. One of his counterparts who lives in Eurasia is the Yeti, or the abominable snowman. And again, check out this clip, right? This show ran for quite a while. It ran from 2011 to 2018. So 7 years plus a special in 2021. And in all that time, a Bigfoot was never found. But you can watch them here looking for Bigfoot. And basically this involves going into the forest with special equipment like infrared cameras. They will often make noises to try to attract Bigfoot. Um, how they know what noises to make, I don't know. Uh, because as we'll see, there's no type specimen for Bigfoot, right? We don't, if it did exist, we don't know what noises it would make. Um, right? But we all probably have some idea of what Sasquatch slash Bigfoot is supposed to be like, right? He's supposed to be an intelligent bipedal ape who doesn't like to come into contact with people. He makes strange noises like screaming or knocking on trees. And a recent addition to Bigfoot lore has been the smell. Bigfoot is said to have some kind of terrible odor about him, which, I mean, kind of makes me think that, of course, what we're dealing with is not a large bipedal ape, but some other creatures. I mean, we all know that certain creatures emit a foul odor, right? I mean, skunks. We've all encountered skunks, haven't we? Actually, I've been encountering one recently while up here. At nights, I'll go outside and there will be a skunk. In fact, as I was meandering through the neighborhood late last night, I could smell the skunk and I thought, well, I better watch out. I don't want to get sprayed while I'm trying to take a photograph. Yeah, the skunk ape, right? But what if I told you that skunks are not the only animals that smell horrible? I mean, skunks are related to other animals that also have scent glands. Not as potent as skunks, but a lot of wild animals have a kind of weird musk about them. As a matter of fact, my sister, who lives probably an hour out of town here, rescued a couple of foxes from a fur farm a few years ago. And let me tell you, foxes smell terrible. Yeah, they smell a lot like a skunk. In this case, it's not a scent gland that produces the smell, it's the urine. But if you smelled it, you would think there might be a skunk in the area. They do not smell nice. Um, they smell way worse than dogs. So, you know, here's maybe an example where what we think is evidence for a cryptid is actually indicative of just some animal, a skunk or otherwise, that's going around marking its territory or something. So, how did the myth of Bigfoot get started? Get myself out of the way here. Um, well, Loxton and Prothero in their chapter speculate that um, it could just be that tendency that we humans have to imagine um, creatures who are bigger, meaner, stronger versions of ourselves, right? I mean, they write on page 31 in the introduction to their book, fantastic tales of humanoid monsters, ogres, and wild men were common in almost all cultures for thousands of years before the emergence of a canonical portrait of Bigfoot. It is natural that giant lore should be a universal feature of human storytelling. After all, giants are the easiest monsters to imagine, bigger, stronger, wilder versions of ourselves. And there are, as detailed in the beginning of chapter 2 by these authors, lots of stories of these large supernatural beings that we can find all around Canada in Indigenous folklore. Yeah, actually, Mac, that's a good point. Some plants do smell really gross. I don't know if we have corpse flowers in North America, but yeah, that isn't that part of their survival strategy is to smell so bad that a bunch of insects come because they think it's like a decomposing corpse, right? And then they kind of get all the pollen all over and spread it around or whatever. Yeah, inviting pollinators. Yeah. So yeah, could be some stinky plants too. I wouldn't rule it out, depending on where in the world that you were. Um, so there are lots of examples of these giant folkloric beings. Uh, yeah, carrion flies. Yeah, I've never smelled a Bradford pear tree, but now that I know it stinks, I won't sniff one. Um, so, there's lots of different examples. Like there are these stone giants or these stone dwarves that some cultures believed lived underground. Um, the wet cedar tree ogre is one that is mentioned. So, giant supernatural beings are common all over human societies, all over the world. And of course, indigenous folklore is no exception in its inclusion of giant humanoid beings. Hmm. Yeah, I'll have to look up what flowers smell terrible around here just to go and see. Um, but did the Bigfoot myth originate Eastern skunk cabbage? Okay, I'm getting lots of examples of smelly plants. Um, so okay, did Sasquatch, Bigfoot, originate out of some of these myths? Well, it's difficult to say. Um, it seems to have begun with a guy named John W. Burns. Um, the authors tell us in the 1920s, in British Columbia's lush Fraser Valley, a man named John W. Burns collected the original eyewitness reports of encounters with Sasquatch. All of modern Bigfoot mythology grew from this regional seed, spreading across the North American continent and beyond, mutating and hybridizing with later reports, hoaxes, and popular fiction. Now, the original Sasquatch was not a big, hairy bipedal ape. It was just a giant person. They were just like giant indigenous people. Now, Burns was a school teacher and what they called an Indian agent back then. So, teaching on reservations, administering stuff, kind of like a liaison between the First Nations and, I guess the provincial government. Um, so he's spending a lot of time with the native people in the area. Um, John Green, not John Green, the author and the YouTuber, but John Green, the Bigfooter, not Hank Green's brother, different John Green, writes that the Sasquatch with which Mr. Burns readers were familiar were basically giant Indians. And yeah, we don't really use this term anymore. It's still used in the United States, but in Canada we say well, depending on the indigenous group, First Nation, Inuit, Métis, right? So we don't really use this word anymore, but there it is. Although avoiding civilization, they had clothes, fire, weapons, and the like, and lived in villages. They were called hairy giants, it is true, but this was taken to mean they had long hair on their heads, something along the lines of today's hippies. So I don't know when Green is writing this. It must have been in the 60s or 70s, but the Sasquatches were big and giant people, and they were hairy, but they were hairy like this, like hair, long hair, not fur all over their bodies, right? So, yeah, John Green explains that well. John Burns is collecting these eyewitness accounts of Sasquatches. Now, I'm sorry for this quote. Apparently, this is a real quote. I think it's a little cringe, but Burns quoted one of the local natives as saying, and I'm sorry, to all who now hear, I, Chief Flying Eagle, say, some white men have seen Sasquatch. Many Indians have seen Sasquatch and spoke to him. Sasquatch still live all around here. Yeah, like a commune. Yeah, yeah. I bet a lot of maybe Sasquatch just was some hippies, so maybe some tall hippies from somewhere in a commune, right? Um, but yeah, this is a bit cringe. So this is his report from what the Chehalis people were saying, and we're actually not sure. Yeah, I was trying really hard not to do that. Um, Yeah, where they have, yeah, the old Hollywood where they've got like an Italian guy playing a Native American or something. And yeah, just, oh, no, no, no. We're not doing that. But that's what it sounds like. It sounds like this quote does not sound like how indigenous people speak. It sounds like how Hollywood movies depicted them speaking. So, did Burns just make this up? Maybe. Um, it's possible that the Chehalis people, the people that he was liaising with, were pulling his leg. Like, get a load of this guy, Burns. We told him there are these giant people in the woods, and he believes us, right? It might have been that, or Burns. He might have been chummy with the indigenous folks and been in on the joke, and maybe they were pranking everyone else from outside of their community. We don't know the story, but what we do know is that this is where the myth originated. And important to emphasize once again, the Sasquatch of Burns was not like our modern um, kind of the way we imagine Bigfoot now. How did that happen? How did Bigfoot go from just giant human to big hairy ape? Well, um, we'll get there. First, word needed to spread. Like, so far this is all pretty local. How did word of Sasquatch get out of the Fraser Valley and kind of go international? Well, the authors tell us in 1957, the provincial government made funding available for projects celebrating the centennial of British Columbia. The town of Harrison Hot Springs would qualify for $600, which was a good chunk of change back then. Qualify for $600 of that funding if it could propose a suitable project. The village council brainstormed and settled on a scheme to dust off and exploit a largely forgotten local legend. Why not fund a Sasquatch hunt? Now, the proposal never received any funding, but the story of the Sasquatch hunt went viral. Um, newspapers all over Canada were running stories on this, and the story spread around the world, as far away, the authors tell us, as New Zealand and Sweden. And the British Columbia Centennial Committee even offered a $5,000 reward to anyone who could produce a Sasquatch specimen. Um, that's a lot of money in 1957. So much money. I mean, I'm sure they were reasonably confident they would never have to pay it to anybody, but this attracted people from Canada and from around the world. Rene Dahinden from Switzerland, who would later go on to become a well-known Bigfooter, was there. Um, John Burns turned up, the school teacher who originated the Sasquatch tales along with the Chehalis people. He spoke to the press about these giant indigenous people that apparently were very secluded and lived in the forest. Um, of course, they're also not just jokers and investigators, but also hoaxers were drawn to the area. One example that's mentioned is an expedition that set out from Lillooet um, that were, I think, eventually waylaid by a flood, so they didn't actually get to where they intended to go, but their intention was actually to create Sasquatch tracks using these giant plywood feet that they had constructed. So that's the origin of the Sasquatch myth, and that's why it started to go viral. And people kind of forgot about it for a while until William Rowe came along. Uh, he claimed to have encountered a Sasquatch while hiking, but he called it Bigfoot. Or he didn't call it Bigfoot. He describes a creature that's a lot more like the way Bigfoot is imagined to be nowadays. This is what he said. He said, "My first impression was of a huge man, about 6 feet tall, almost 3 feet wide, and probably weighing somewhere near 300 pounds. It was covered from head to foot with dark brown silver tipped hair. But as it came closer, I saw by its breasts that it was female. Its arms were much thicker than a man's arms and longer, reaching almost to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionally than a man's, about 5 inches wide at the front and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked, it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see the gray-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. The head was higher at the back than at the front. The nose was broad and flat. The lips and chin protruded farther than its nose. But the hair that covered it, leaving bare only the parts of its face around the mouth, nose, and ears, made it resemble an animal as much as a human. None of this hair, even on the back of its head, was longer than an inch, and its neck was also unhuman, thicker and shorter than any man's I had ever seen. Now, I mean, to me, a skeptic, that just sounds like a bear. Um, how could you mistake a bear for a giant bipedal ape? Well, I don't know. What are viewing conditions like? Um, how is Roe's vision? Uh, was Roe prone to exaggerating or telling tall tales? Um, I don't know. But as the authors say on page 38, to a profound extent, Bigfoot lore stands or falls on Roe. If true, Roe's story remains among the most detailed and informative close-range sightings of an undiscovered primate. If Roe invented his creature, however, then a very dark shadow falls over all the reports that parrot his description, which is to say most of the cases in the Bigfoot database. Now, why? Well, because this is the first time. Remember, prior to this, Sasquatch is imagined to be this giant, magical type of human who lives in the woods. Now, all of a sudden, we've got an ape. I mean, humans are apes, yes, but something that looks much more ape-like than we do. You know, with more fur and a sort of gorilla-like build, perhaps, right? And if Roe was wrong or making this up, then all the subsequent sightings have to be called into question. And I'm not saying, you know, Roe might have been, for lack of a better term, bullshitting. Roe might have been mistaken. He might have seen another creature like a bear. I mean, we're talking Canada, right? Much of Canada has black bears. Of course, on the West Coast, there are brown bears. Um, if you go far enough north, you're going to see polar bears, lots of bears. Um, and bears, when they stand up, look really weird, right? If the viewing conditions were not optimal, as the authors say later in this chapter, I think you certainly could be mistaken about what you were seeing. But Roe is also a very mysterious figure. No other cryptozoologists seem to have ever met him before he died. So this is a sort of well, like the authors say, right? The lore stands or falls on Roe's account because prior to Roe, we have a very different picture of Sasquatch. After Roe, Roe is the first alleged eyewitness account, which paints a picture of a giant ape, you know, something much more ape-like than human-like. um, what happened next? Well, Bigfoot started to go international once again. In fact, you could say Bigfoot became Bigfoot the year after the Harrison Hot Springs Sasquatch hunt. Um, the authors write, for all the press that the Harrison Hot Springs Sasquatch hunt received in 1957, the legend retained a quaint Canadian flavor until the following year. In 1958, in the region surrounding Bluff Creek, California, the Sasquatch, rebranded Bigfoot, became a breakout American hit. And it all started with Raymond Wallace. Raymond Wallace was a road construction worker and a known prankster. And he found big, giant human-like footprints around the equipment uh, near his work sites. Of course, he was the one making these. He made them with big, giant wooden feet that he would strap onto his shoes. Um, he would um, he would do this for the rest of his life, periodically making fake Bigfoot tracks, right? And this pictured here is Jerry Crew, a bulldozer operator who worked with Wallace. He made the first plaster casts out of these tracks. And if you've seen a documentary on Bigfoot, you have no doubt seen these plaster casts of the footprints. And this is indeed where the Bigfoot name comes from these plaster casts. How do we know that he was faking it? Well, after he died, Wallace's family revealed one of the sets of wooden feet that he had used. This, I believe, is his nephew with a pair of wooden feet. Now, we don't have the feet that were used to fake the original tracks, but we do have sets of wooden feet that match other tracks that Wallace was alleged to have made. Again, we're dealing with somebody who's a pretty well-known joker, prankster. He once claimed that he had captured a Bigfoot and had to release it later while he was negotiating with other Bigfoot researchers for his sale. He claimed it would only eat really big bags of, I think it was Frosted Flakes, um, right? Um, there's a glaring sort of tendency to omit um, Wallace's role in the development of the Bigfoot myth by cryptozoologists. They kind of just gloss over the fact that he was a well-known prankster, hoaxer, jokey type person, somebody who'd always play tricks on his friends, tell tall tales, and so forth. Um, yeah, this is a pretty irresponsible omission. Um, and kind of like Roe's account, right? If Roe was making it up or was mistaken about seeing a large bipedal ape, um, a lot of the that means our data set is contaminated. Likewise with these footprints. We know that Wallace was a hoaxer. Um, so all of that evidence, including, say, for example, this image on the previous slide, has to be discarded. Loxton and Prothero conclude, at least concerning Bluff Creek, if cryptozoology is to achieve its scientific aspirations, it cannot afford to be precious about even its own bedrock cases or to be unduly deferential to figures respected in the cryptozoological subculture. You know, this is cherry picking evidence. This is omitting important other lines of evidence contrary to the claims concerning Bigfoot that these researchers make. And it's the appeal to authority. And these are all fallacious ways of thinking. At the very least, they continue, we must acknowledge that the footprints cast by Jerry Crew and the other Bluff Creek tracks are contaminated by their close association with a habitual hoaxer and must be quarantined from the database of Bigfoot evidence. Where do we go from here? Well, probably the most famous piece of evidence for Bigfoot of all time. This is a still from the Patterson-Gimlin film. I'm sure you've seen it. In fact, I've linked footage of it that was displayed in a natural. There was the film was part of a National Geographic documentary. Oh, excuse me. Which you can find on YouTube. So I've linked to that. But this is the famous, kind of Bigfoot walking through the forest away from the camera. So these two cowboys, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, went down to Bluff Creek, where these tracks had been faked. And they said, we're going to film Bigfoot. And they did really fast. So it's come to be known as the Patterson-Gimlin film. And it's very shaky camera showing this figure walking away from the videographer. So again, check out the full clip if you've never seen it. Here's what the author says. I'm going to say something that will be unpopular on both sides of the debate. No one knows whether the film depicts a real Sasquatch or a man in a gorilla suit. Um, what we need in order to know is a type specimen. See, in biology, that's how we identify new species. You have to produce a type specimen, a specimen that is typical of the species you've discovered. So if I claim that I've found a new animal, I have to provide a type specimen. When Europeans first arrived in Australia and New Zealand, they saw creatures that looked so different than what they were used to seeing that when they sent the specimens back, some of the researchers back home thought that they had been faked, right? Um, Especially the duck-billed platypus, which is a weird animal, right? It's a mammal, but it lays eggs and it has a beak. Um, and it's got these weird venomous barbs, right? What a weird creature. They sent specimens back. And biologists at the time were like, this can't be real. But because they had a specimen that they were able to examine, they could see that not only was it not a hoax, it was in fact a new creature, a new creature to the European scientists, that is, and they were able to study it. And now, of course, we know that duck-billed platypuses are real and not a joke being played on anyone, right? Um, that's what you need to identify a new species. You need a type specimen, and we would need a type specimen in order to determine whether the tape um, uh, whether the Patterson Gimlin film is a forgery or not. Or alternatively, what we would need is a confession of hoaxing, um, or some piece of evidence that proves that the film was a forgery, like if somebody can't reproduce the gorilla suit that was worn, if it was a gorilla suit, right? This film was a big deal in that it was not just the topic of discussion for it was not just a topic of discussion for cryptozoologists, but also zoologists and anthropologists. However, circumstantial factors, the authors state, may cast light on the plausibility of the case. Roger Patterson's character, the serendipitous circumstances of the filming, hearsay testimony that the film was a hoax, and the apparently derivative structure of Patterson's narrative and the money that Patterson earned from the film. And the authors go through a number of different points here. But Patterson, the guy behind the camera, is described by people who knew him as a sort of used car salesman type. Um, Someone who's kind of slippery, like a slippery character. Um, he uh, he made a lot of money from the film, obviously. And it's just curious his timing. Like he and Bob Gimlin show up and say we're going to film Bigfoot, and then later that day they film Bigfoot. I mean, I'm sorry, it's a little bit suspicious, isn't it? So Patterson, without going through the exhaustive list that the authors do, Patterson had the means and the motive to create a hoax. And also key bono, right? I mean, Patterson made a lot of money off of this film. So kind of a shady character. And I wonder, as I'm sure others have, that in the age of smartphones, why have we never got another um, bit of video of Sasquatch or Bigfoot? I mean, the Patterson Gimlin film, like to go back to the still here. I mean, this was taken in the late 60s, on a handheld camera. The footage is very shaky, but this is still the clearest depiction of what is allegedly Bigfoot ever. And that's the late 60s. And now we have high definition cameras in our pockets. Why hasn't anyone else got better film or video, rather, of this creature? I mean, there are so many things that um, we see so much more of thanks to the cameras on our phones, and to other kinds of cameras like um, uh, meteors. The meteor that geez, it must be close to a decade ago now, but there was a meteor that exploded over Russia a few years ago. Um, which a site like that is hard to capture on camera. But because car insurance is so weird in Russia, everyone has dash cams. And so there were hundreds and hundreds of dash cams that captured this meteor streaking over Russia before it exploded. And thanks to cell phones, we see more of these events, events that previously very few people would have seen. So if I can draw an analogy between these celestial events and Sasquatch sightings, why haven't we got the footage? Why, um, you know, if Finding Bigfoot was on for 7 years, did they never find Bigfoot? Right? Probably because there's no Bigfoot to find. Um, Now, before we go on to the Bossberg Cripplefoot case, does anyone have any questions? Because we are actually over halfway through these slides. I worry I'm going a bit fast. I mean, well, what do you think? Did any of you have the chance to read this chapter, or are any of you thinking of doing your paper on cryptozoology or on some kind of cryptid? All right, no questions. Well, tell you what, why don't we take a break? Let's take a break of about 15 minutes. So let's come back at about 3:50, and then we'll finish off the slides, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do for our final lecture. Does that sound good to everyone? Excellent. Okay, I'll see you all in about 15 minutes. Okay, let's get back to it. So we left off around here, discussing the Patterson Gimlin film. We'll move on to another alleged uh, close encounter, we could call it, the case of the Bossberg Cripplefoot tracks. What do the authors have to say, oh, excuse me, about this set of tracks? They tell us that in 1969, Bossberg, then a dying mining town and now a ghost town, was the new home of a Bigfoot hunter named Ivan Marks. In an extraordinary coincidence, Bigfoot tracks promptly turned up at Marks's local garbage dump in late November. Even more coincidentally, discovered by Marks himself. Where do we get the name Cripplefoot? Well, um, the right foot appeared to be malformed, and so we called it Cripplefoot. Now, this was an interesting case because, well, as the authors say, the uh, the tracks in Bluff Creek were what helped to make Bigfoot a household name outside of well, uh, in America and in Canada. I mean, previously it was known as Sasquatch and was a sort of Canadian had a Canadian flavor about it, as the authors say. So the Patterson Gimlin film likewise gave the creature a public face, a public image, and the Cripplefoot case, to paraphrase the authors on page 50, attracted some of Bigfoot's highest credentialed scientific defenders. So real zoologists, anthropologists, biologists, not merely cryptozoologists. Um, they tell us that the find led to a kind of Sasquatch gold rush. Everyone involved in the search for Bigfoot descended on Bossberg, armed with everything from tranquilizer guns to aircraft. The stampede reached a fever pitch when a hoaxer named Joe Meltow came forward with the claim to have a Sasquatch for sale. So Bigfoot hunters were coming from all over the place, and of course, the creature was never caught, because there arguably wasn't a creature to catch. Marks, incidentally, continued finding tracks even after all of this hype died down. He claimed to have even recorded some footage of Bigfoot, but he was busted by another Bigfoot hunter, Peter Byrne. He discovered that Marks had faked his footage. And around the same time, in a nearby town called Arden, a bricklayer by the name of Ray Pickens had also been hoaxing tracks just to show that anyone is capable of doing this, right? So where does this leave us, the authors ask? The bottom line is that the famous Cripplefoot trackways were discovered by a repeat Bigfoot hoaxer. This is a red flag so huge and glaring that the evidence from Bossberg should long ago have been set aside by all serious Bigfoot researchers. Bizarrely, the exact opposite has happened. Even knowing that Marks hoaxed Cripplefoot-related evidence at the time that he found the tracks, some Bigfooters find it impossible to set aside what they view as the inherent believability of the Cripplefoot prints. And if you read through the details of how Marks was busted, it's quite interesting because Peter Byrne was actually funding him, providing, like equipping him to go and find Bigfoot while he was out doing this fakery. And it was because of that rapport that Byrne had developed with Marks that he was able to catch him faking things. That he was, you know, that it was revealed that he had faked the footage that he claimed to have recorded of Bigfoot, etc. So definitely worth taking a closer look at the book. So where are we at the end of this sort of survey of the history of Sasquatch slash Bigfoot? Well, the evidence doesn't look good, right? And that's indeed one of the problems with this research, filtering good evidence from bad, right? The history of all of this is full of examples of pranks, hoaxes, and fakery. Kind of like the early like in the age of spiritualism in the 19th century when psychical research was really kicking off. There were a lot of examples of mediums who were engaged in fraudulent behavior. There were fraudulent photographers doing spirit photography. The Cottingley fairies, as well, is another example of that. The same thing tends to happen here with cryptozoology. We've got a lot of examples of evidence that we know to be poor, that we know is not reliable. There might be some reliable evidence somewhere, but how do we tell the good from the bad, right? And another problem is, of course, the reliability of eyewitnesses. If you really want a good example of this, I encourage you to check out the short true crime series Sasquatch. which I believe if you're in Canada, you can watch it on Crave. Elsewhere, Hulu. Um, Actually, I'm curious. Has anyone seen this? It's a three-part true crime documentary. It's called Sasquatch because, and it starts off like, okay, this is about Sasquatch, but actually it gets really crazy. I don't want to ruin it, but um why I mention it, the reliability of eyewitness accounts is because we have a report of a Sasquatch attack in this film, which turns out to actually have been a grisly murder with heavy machinery. It gets in it. I don't want to spoil it too much. I really do hope you decide to go watch it one day. But essentially, where we are led in this is down this sort of criminal conspiracy sort of world, into this conspiracy sort of world in the illicit cannabis trade. And what seems to have happened is that um, uh, some of the workers for one of these cannabis farmers were murdered. I don't remember why. Uh, I believe they were also what is sort of pejoratively referred to as tweakers, users of crystal methamphetamine. Um, and so the eyewitness, someone who saw this happen, thought it was Bigfoot, um, when it was heavy machinery being used to kill these people. Because I suppose they were, I don't know, perhaps they were high, perhaps they were in withdrawal. I don't know, but it's absolutely nuts. But it goes to show you that eyewitness testimony is not always reliable. And as far as I mean, right here, I'm coming to you from Northern Ontario, not too far north, mind you, but I'm up here in North Bay. And I grew up in the country, kind of between here and Sudbury, Ontario. And I've heard a lot of big fish stories. And what that means is that I know a lot of people um, who exaggerate claims concerning interesting things that they've seen in the area. Right. I know people that will, I caught a fish. How big was it? Oh, it was this big. Right. I've encountered just growing up, I've heard so many claims of very large fish like pike or muskellunge being caught that are just far bigger than they could ever actually be. Bears are described, um, as much taller than black bears can ever get. I've seen people, I've heard people claim that they've seen eagles and other birds of prey with like 10-foot wingspans, and they just do not get that big, right? Um, so those are some examples of that, right? And even just in the local lore, I remember my parents used to have a camp on Lake Washagami, which is kind of off in the boonies. It's a little bit north of here, but it's in an area where there's no electricity, and the people who live there are very much, like your homesteader types. And even just talking to people when I was young, like you'd always hear stories of weird stuff under the water. Really big catfish, really big muskie, sturgeon, right? But described as bigger than these creatures actually get, right? So a lot of big fish stories. Um, Loxton and Prothero raise a good point here concerning eyewitness testimony. They say worse, as we have discussed, eyewitness reports um, are variable and diverge often from the popular canonical Bigfoot. Some accounts feature Sasquatches with huge pointed ears, complex markings, or heights over 12 feet tall. Bigfoot is reported in many colors, at many sizes, with many diverging anatomies. In some reports, Bigfoot can speak human languages. And although this is systematically downplayed in the mainstream Bigfoot literature, it is very common for witnesses to claim that Bigfoot has paranormal features and abilities, such as eyes that literally glow, psychic powers, or flying saucer type vehicles, which is what I was alluding to earlier. I haven't really seen this discussed in, on a show like Finding Bigfoot, but I have heard it discussed on Ancient Aliens. So Bigfoot, aliens, just so you know. Of course, humans are liable to make misidentification errors. We do this all the time. I think that a lot of people believe that they've seen Bigfoot, but is what they saw really Bigfoot? Probably not. Um, could have been a tree stump, could have been a bear. Maybe it was even somebody dressed up as Bigfoot, right? And we have discussed um, previously in this course some of the reasons why our brains have evolved to make these misidentification errors, right? Because, I mean, really, a lot of this, what this boils down to is our evolutionary sort of hunter-gatherer brains seeing things in nature which we mistakenly identify as living creatures, or different kinds of living creatures than they are, because it's better to have a false positive than a false negative, evolutionarily speaking, right? And indeed, this is probably why there's giant lore in cultures all over the world, right? Um, Also, there is a prime candidate for these misidentification errors, and that is bears, right? The authors write here in 2009, a paper in the Journal of Biogeography found that Sasquatch distribution is essentially identical to black bear distribution. They wrote, although it is possible that Sasquatch and Ursus americanus share such remarkably similar bioclimatic requirements, we nonetheless suspect that many Bigfoot sightings are, in fact, of black bears. I mean, who's seen a bear? Some of us must have seen some bears. I have. I've seen a lot of bears. But what about all of you? Thomas says, yeah. You ever see a bear stand up? It's kind of weird. In a zoo, yeah. In a zoo, we can see bears, but in person, I remember actually quite recently, I was driving. Well, I wasn't driving, my partner was driving, but we were on our way back to Ottawa from here, and on the side of the highway, there was a black bear standing up on the side of the road, kind of in the ditch, and he was just kind of watching the cars go by. Um, and it was very cool because you could see, like, wow, what a curious creature. He's watching the traffic and he's going to make sure it's safe to cross the road when, when he finally decides to go for it. Yeah. And of course, my first job when I was finished high school, I was a garbage man. And so we would go, it was out in a very small municipality where I worked 3 days a week. Um, and on Monday we would I forget the way we did it. I think oftentimes on Monday we would go to the dump to empty the truck, and or no, it was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday I worked. So yeah, Tuesdays I think we would make a trip to the dump. Wednesday was a shorter day, and the Thursday was the busiest day, and we would sometimes hit the dump twice. And often in the spring and summer there were bears. And they'd be standing up, looking at what we were doing, and then of course when all the garbage started falling out of the truck, they'd kind of get spooked and run away and come back later and pick through the garbage and find some delicious stuff to eat. And bears are neat to watch, but you can imagine that if the viewing conditions were not optimal, you might mistake it, especially if it was standing up, for some other kind of creature. In fact, the authors of the text note one of them has seen um, a bear actually walk on its hind legs, which bears do not often do, but they can do, and notes how eerily human-like it looks when they do that. Olivia's seen a bear. Yeah, okay. So a few of you have seen some bears. If you get the chance to see them in nature, that's the best. Of course, I've seen around here we have black bears, so that's what I see. Um, I think I've seen polar bears at the zoo. But the last time I went to the zoo, it was just really sad. So, yeah. Oh, cool. A cub, yeah. Yeah, I'd often see them growing up in the fields. There were open fields that the bears would like to inhabit. Sometimes you'd see a mom with a couple cubs. Yeah, because you're kind of like, where is mom, right? Especially if it's a brown bear, because they're bigger. Black bears are big, but brown bears are bigger. I mean, I feel like I could scare a black bear away. I would not I wouldn't want to be I wouldn't want to face down a brown bear like a big grizzly bear or something. Like, nope, nope, I'm okay. But my favorite bear is the polar bear because they're very metal. Now, um, what about all the footprints? I mean, as we've seen, uh, all the big examples have been have been faked. Um, yeah, murder bears. That's right. I have a friend actually who used to live up in Cochrane, which is up close to James Bay, um, on in Ontario. And when that freezes over, they do see polar bears. It's not close to the Arctic Circle or anything, but it's because Hudson Bay and James Bay is cold enough that when it freezes, the bears can go out and hunt, get seals and stuff. So um, sometimes you can also see them in northern parts of Quebec, Labrador. You know, it's not just up north. Um, so he's had like when he was young, he's told me like they had incidents where they'd be at school, but they wouldn't be allowed to go outside for recess because there was a bear sighted in the area. So yeah, polar bears are pretty crazy, pretty amazing, majestic killing machines. But yeah, when it comes to the footprints, I mean, um, all of the major examples that we've looked at seem to have been produced by hoaxers. And in fact, as I was putting together some resources for this, and I was watching clips of Finding Bigfoot on YouTube, there was one clip I watched. It's not the clip that I linked to you, but it's a similar one. Came up like, on autoplay of an alleged track, which it sounds very much like the tracks that we've looked at today, or look very much like the tracks that we saw today, where that was sort of very wide in the front and very narrow toward the back. And it was they were showing a photo that a couple were camping, and apparently Bigfoot started messing around with their tent and left a track. What this looked like to me was you know um that thing dogs do where they scratch up the soil and kick soil to spread their scent around. Actually, my dog Tula does it all the time. But have you ever seen a dog doing that? Often after they have relieved themselves, and they kind of do that scratching with the front and back paws. I mean, to me, this just looked like that. So I'm thinking, I put my skeptic hat on. I'm thinking fox, coyote, something like that. Just went to the bathroom and then did that scratching behavior. But this couple was convinced that it looked like a Bigfoot track. But of course, a lot of the tracks we've looked at are fake. There are ambiguous tracks, but they can be chalked up to anything from confirmation bias, wishful thinking, and even pareidolia, right? If we see an ambiguous mark in the snow, but we're all primed and ready to find Bigfoot, we might see it as a Bigfoot track or a Sasquatch track. And really, the fundamental problem is not even the fakery. An even bigger problem is one that we've mentioned before, and that is that we do not have a type specimen. right? Um, to evaluate Sasquatch, the authors say we need to look at and there's a typo in their book. That's not me. That's actually in the book. Um, an actual Sasquatch foot. Because otherwise, how do we know what a Sasquatch foot is supposed to look like, right? Again, I don't want to seem like I'm being too hard on the people, the people on finding Bigfoot, but when they do things like make their Sasquatch calls, how do you know that's what a Sasquatch sounds like, right? We don't have a type specimen. We don't have a Sasquatch in a zoo that we can observe making these calls. So when these Bigfoot hunters are going out into the forest and going like, "Oh," making these Sasquatch calls, well, like, what? I mean, sure, there are probably people have heard strange calls in the woods, but most people are not experts on animal vocalizations, right? Like, for example, um, we might be familiar, we might hear a wolf or a coyote and recognize it as such because their vocalizations are pretty dog-like, right? Um, but then again, people can be easily mistaken. I remember when we first came up to Northern Ontario to live when I was about 10 years old. My parents had a kennel with Siberian Huskies, and Huskies don't really bark like other dogs. They howl and they roo, but they don't bark. So they sound very wolf-like. And the neighbors, shortly after we moved up, started saying, "Hey, have you heard the pack of wolves that's roaming in the area?" Of course, there was no pack of wolves. It was our dogs howling at night, like dogs do. But what about other creatures? I mean, have you ever heard the sound that a deer or an elk or caribou makes? I mean, anyone? Have you ever like have you really? I've heard them on television, and they are strange noises, to be sure. Almost sounds like a rusty gate opening. These ungulate, uh, yeah, foxes. Yeah, foxes can make weird noises. Even if I were to go back out to my parents' place around this time of year, I would probably hear a lot of grouse, and grouse make this weird like a lawnmower starting up. And if you didn't know what that was, you might think, well, what kind of big giant creature is that making this deep, scary noise? It's just a bird about this big, by the way. It's nothing to be afraid of. But yeah, foxes can make these like noises where they sounds almost like a child who's injured, right? So most people are not experts about animal vocalizations, and what they're probably hearing is just some, you know, rather typical animal and not a Sasquatch. Um, a bit like the people who exaggerate the size of creatures they claim to have seen. Although one creature it's hard to exaggerate the size of is a moose. Like people will say, "Oh, I saw a bear and it stood up and it was 12 feet tall." I mean, black bears just don't get that big, but moose do. Here's a question: who has seen a moose in real life? Because they are enormous. Aaron, have you? Yeah, Aaron has, Thomas, Olivia. Yeah, they really are that big. They are enormous. Um, so cool stuff. So yeah, all over. Yeah, they live all over the place. The moose is the biggest species of deer. And they do quite well all over Canada. I remember seeing them when I was young. There are a lot of swamps, dirt roads with swamps on either side, and the moose like to hang out in the swamps. So I've seen a few moose in my day. But what about physical evidence of Bigfoot? beyond footprints? What about like fur, fluids, DNA, something like that? This is what the authors say. They say for many considering Bigfoot for the first time, the solution seems obvious. Why not test Bigfoot's hair or DNA? Samples of possible Sasquatch hair, scat, and fluids have been collected fairly often. As it turns out, many promising samples have been analyzed by experts or even sequenced for DNA. To date, they have all been a bust. This is disappointing, but it is not the end of the bad news. It seems that testing hair would be unable to solve the mystery, even if Bigfooters were able to discover samples of genuine Sasquatch hair. It is the same type specimen problem that plagues footprint evidence and eyewitness reports. No one has any idea what Sasquatch hair would look like. So, what it really comes down to um, is this lack of a type specimen. If someone finds some fur somewhere and says, I think this is Bigfoot fur, how would we know? We could test it until the cows come home. And sure, maybe it would, maybe we could identify it as some other kind of animal fur. But say that it did come from a Sasquatch, how could we genetically determine that it is a Sasquatch without a type specimen? We need a type specimen to compare it to. But of course, the biggest problem for Bigfoot hunters is hoaxing. Well, for serious Bigfoot hunters. A lot of Bigfoot hunters are themselves hoaxers. So, as we've seen today, right, a lot of the evidence that we've considered can be explained as either a hoax or a joke or a prank, and these all contaminate our data set. And so the authors conclude the two great cliches ruling the evidence of Bigfoot literature are the mountain of evidence and the connected argument where there's smoke, there's fire. This is a non sequitur. Where there's smoke, there's smoke. And in this case, that smoke is so widespread that it actually argues against the existence of Bigfoot. So, why is it that Sasquatch slash Bigfoot became such a sensation and Ogopogo didn't? Well, probably partially to do with the nature of Bigfoot hoaxing um, and location. Right, if you want to go see Ogopogo, you have to go to Okanagan Lake. I mean, assuming it exists. I don't believe it exists, but if it did exist, you would have to go there to see it. You can't see Ogopogo anywhere else because it lives in that lake. Um, in fact, different lakes all over Canada are rumored to have different lake monsters in them. And indeed, all over the world, right? Like Nessie is supposed to reside in Loch Ness. If you want to see the Loch Ness monster, you have to go to Loch Ness, right? Um, just a few other examples of Canadian cryptids are the Ogopogo, which is said to live in Lake Simcoe in Ontario, or Memphrey in Lake Memphremagog in Quebec. So there are, wherever you've got a big lake, um, you've got an alleged lake monster. In fact, I'm in North Bay. We're right on the shores of Lake Nipissing, which is not a huge lake, but it's not exactly a small lake. I wonder if there's a lake monster that's purported to live here. I'm going to Google it right now. And if any of you are close to any large lakes, take a quick look. Let's see. Lake Nipissing. It would be weird, Lake Nipissing has a great surface area, but it only an average depth of 15 feet. As a matter of fact, when I went swimming last week, I walked out probably about half a kilometer before the water was up to my neck, and it was nice and warm. Mm. Yep, here we go. Apparently, in the 1930s, just wait for this page to load, but apparently in the 1930s, someone claimed to um, Loch Ness monster sighting in Ontario. Well, that doesn't make sense, but um, yes, apparently someone claimed. Oh, June 2001. I was going to another lake and cottage to go on a fishing trip. I looked over and saw a huge water creature break the surface of the water. I'm certain this was the real deal. It stayed surface for more than 5 minutes. Interesting. So there you have it. Any large lake or body of water is probably going to have some kind of cryptid associated with it. And I wouldn't be surprised if you were to look back into the folklore of the Nipissing First Nation, you would see tales of spirits that inhabited the lake. I would not be surprised at all if that were the case, right? Oh, sea monster in the river on the Ottawa River. Oh, well, the Ottawa River is a pretty cool river. So and the Ottawa River is interesting because of the history, the human history bound up with it, right? I mean, it was an important waterway for the indigenous people and for European explorers. In fact, where I am right now in North Bay is kind of at the intersection of two different watersheds. So just over there, just a 5 minute walk that way is Trout Lake, which feeds into, I believe, the Mattawa River, which feeds into the Ottawa River. That way is Lake Nipissing, which feeds into Georgian Bay on Lake Huron, the French River to Georgian Bay, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were an indigenous person moving around with the seasons, or if you were a European explorer who was being shown around by the locals, and you wanted to get from up from the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes, and you didn't want to deal with Niagara Falls, you went up the Ottawa River, eventually ending up in Trout Lake over there, and then you would portage to Lake Nipissing, which would eventually, if you follow the I believe it's the French River, you would get to Georgian Bay, and then you'd be in the Great Lakes, and then you could continue on westward. So here, this tiny little tiny town that I call home is actually a historic sort of intersection in this country, which is cool. So if you think of it that way, of course there's going to be folklore about creatures living, in the Ottawa River or in Lake Nipissing or in the Great Lakes. I'm sure there's some folklore about a monster in the Great Lakes, right? Um, but the point is, if you want to see Ogopogo, you have to go to Lake Okanagan, right? If you want to see any of the other ones, they're in whatever lake they live in. They don't move. They don't move around, right? But Bigfoot is the kind of creature, or people imagine to be the kind of creature that's maybe more like a bear. Um, it moves around, and I'm unfamiliar with cryptozoologists' estimate of Bigfoot's numbers, but given the number of sightings, you would have to suppose that they think that there is a reasonably high number of these creatures out there. So that is why, probably thanks to a combination of the publicity over hoaxing and the nature of this imagined creature, that is why um, you see it in various places, or people believe they see it in various places. Um, so should we believe in Bigfoot or other cryptids? I don't think so. Um, Again, if you want to see why, check out Loxton and Prothero's book, Abominable Science, Origins of the Yeti, Nessie, and Other Famous Cryptids. And they really do cover quite a few different cryptids from all over the world. And again, you can access this from the Carleton University Library in digital form. So you can check it out for free. I think we should be skeptical of reports of cryptids. After all, there are creatures that we believed were extinct, which we rediscover, but that's not cryptozoology. That's zoology, right? That's just, it happens sometimes. Um, we also discover new species of animals all the time, right? Sometimes, like there's a few ways this happens, right? There's discovery, but there's also identification. So there could be, specimens sitting in museums for decades, that we think are one kind of creature, and then somebody comes along and looks closer and realizes that it's a new type of creature. So we'll say we've identified a new species, even though it was sitting in a drawer, for 30 years, right? Or however long it was sitting there. So we discover new creatures and we rediscover new creatures all the time. And that's just how zoology works, how biology works. Well, the squirrels are really being noisy today. Oh, and there's a little woodpecker up there. It's quite nice doing lectures from the backyard. I think I'm going to do this more often. Um, Now there of course are creatures from folklore that are, as we discussed earlier, based on real creatures. Um, Mermaids, right? Mermaids and mermen are probably just manatees and dugongs. Um, no one's ever gone and found a mermaid that turned out to be half human and half fish, right? So, yes, there are creatures from folklore based on real animals, but no one's ever gone out and found a mermaid or a troll or something. I mean, sure, there have been lots of hoaxes of such creatures, and that's probably maybe one reason why people were skeptical of those duck-billed platypus specimens. But like P.T. Barnum in his museum, he had composite skeletons that were alleged to be mermaids and unicorns and other mythical creatures, but he never claimed that any of them were genuine. Um, uh, he didn't say, yes, this is a real mermaid skeleton that I've got. He just said, hey, here's this weird skeleton. It doesn't matter if you believe in mermaids or not, but just come and take a look at it. And it's pretty weird, right? Um, so, um, yeah, we probably should not believe in the reality of folkloric creatures. Um, so, as a student of mine once said, the real Bigfoot is the friends we made along the way. Uh, is it, okay to go Bigfoot hunting with your friends, with a crew of people? Yeah, probably. Are you going to find Bigfoot? Almost certainly not. I think belief in this sort of thing is relatively innocuous, provided that you're not getting ripped off, right? If you're not dishing out your life savings for samples of Bigfoot fur or alleged Bigfoot fur, it's probably okay. And I say this, again, with respect to a lot of the stuff that we've covered in this class. If if you want to do a little tarot card or Ouija board session with your friends, or if you want to go out, try to spot a UFO in the sky or find Bigfoot, um, well, you probably won't divine the future or see a spaceship, at least a spaceship of extraterrestrial origin, or see Bigfoot. But you might see something else that's really amazing. I mean, just look at last night. I was looking at the sky, my phone went off. Don't care that there's no flying saucers up there because I got some really cool pictures of the Northern Lights. Um, so even if you don't see any of these things, you will see phenomena that are real and more amazing, frankly. Now, just a few things before we wrap up. There is a final quiz open right now. It's shorter than before, shorter than all the other quizzes. There are 5 uh, true false multi-choice questions on dreams, um, and 1 long answer question, which asks you how your beliefs have changed with regard to the paranormal over the course of this class, if they've changed, and if so, how. Um, the quiz is a little shorter because the last day that you have to complete it is this Wednesday, because that's the last day of class. So I've made the quiz a little shorter. Um, you shouldn't have a difficult time completing it. Oh no, let me see if I can fix that. Maybe I forgot to make it visible. Oh, I forgot to link. I'll fix that right now. I just have to go to quizzes Quiz 5. There. You should now be able to see it. Sorry about that. If you refresh your page, you should now see it. Anyway, it won't be difficult. As I said, just 5 true false multi-choice questions drawn from my Electron Dreams, and then a reflection question that asks you about how your beliefs about the paranormal have or have not changed. um, Jenna, our teaching assistant, and myself are working hard on getting your proposals done by ideally Wednesday, the last day of class. So we're working on that. We'll also be getting your quiz 4 grades back to you as soon as possible, and quiz 5 as well. So bear with us as we get to the end of the term. There's always a bit of a crunch because work tends to pile up. I'm sure you know what it's like yourselves, but we'll get all that feedback back to you soon. What else? Oh yes. I have, if you've emailed me your essay proposal, I have received it. It's just in my travels. I've forgotten to reply to everybody, but if you emailed it, rest assured it's in my inbox. So yeah, I've got a few students that ran into some hiccups, illness, other life circumstances. They ended up emailing them to me. So if you're one of them, don't worry, I got it. I think that's it for the housekeeping stuff when it comes to wrapping up work for the term. For our next lecture, I've titled it Satanic Panic, but what I really want to look at is more broadly the phenomenon of moral panic. So we will talk a little bit about the Satanic Panic of the 80s, but we'll also talk about other moral panics. Um, and it's going to be very seminar style. I will make some resources available for you to read and or watch. But for the last class, it will be very good if you have all those learning materials read or watched and digested before you come to the meeting, so that we can talk. But we'll reflect on the Satanic Panic as an example of moral panic and compare it to other examples of moral panic, one of which is actually a pretty philosophical example. So I'm looking forward to that. So I figure we'll spend a good chunk of the final class on that. And then the last bit of that class, I will dedicate toward answering any questions you have about any of the material from this term or about your essays. But does anyone have any questions for me? I mean, uh, we're I've come up a little bit short on material for today, and I don't know. What do we think? Bigfoot? Yay? Nay? Other cryptids? What do we think? Do we have anyone here that's writing a paper on a cryptid of some kind? Yeah, I saw that, Olivia. I'm gonna check that out as soon as we're done here. Um, because I'm curious to see if there's any. Well, don't spoil it for me, but is there any photographic or videographic evidence? Or oh, really? Oh, okay. I'm kind of excited to check this out then. Yeah, yeah, Jake, the exploding bear. So what folkloric tradition does this exploding bear come from? Whoever said that, I forget who, but I want to know more. Oh yeah, Mac, for sure. I mean, there are absolutely endangered creatures, things that there are absolutely things that we haven't seen. Definitely. May says I'm you are given your topic is about real world explanations for folkloric creatures and cryptids, so I touch. Okay, cool. Yeah. So you'll definitely find Loxton and Prothero's book helpful? Um, yeah, thanks, Jake. If you can get back to me on the exploding bears, I'll appreciate it. Aaron, the two ways that I sort of see cryptids being treated, just to reiterate, are either as like sort of like living fossils. So like Nessie. Some people claim that the Loch Ness monster is a pliosaur, right? So some aquatic reptile that survived the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period, right? That's one way. Um, Another way is a creature from folklore that is taken to actually exist. So that's all on slide. What slide did I have that on? Let's go back to the beginning. So on slide 2, I'd say slides 2 and 3 are where I talk about that. Um, Mac, just to get back to your comment, like about there could be these real creatures. They're actually there's definitely undiscovered creatures, definitely some creatures that are perhaps near extinct and are very solitary. But I think that when we're talking about cryptids, we have to also um, think about whether it's plausible that the creature exists in the ecosystem that we think it does. So in Loch Ness, for example, you know, it's claimed that Nessie is a pliosaur, that's implausible because there just isn't enough food um, to sustain a population of creatures like that in that lake, right? But then, of course, there are some really weird creatures out there that maybe you've never even heard of that are waiting to be discovered or have been discovered, but we just don't know about them yet. Like, where we find a lot of weird stuff is the bottom of the ocean. Seems like every time we go down there, we discover something new. And a show that I a TV show on Animal Planet that I actually really did like, that did a good job with this stuff, was River Monsters. Did anyone ever watch River Monsters with Jeremy Wade, the fisherman? Yeah. So he'd go in there and be like, "Oh, there's stories of this weird monster," and then he'd figure out like what kind of fish it actually was. Right. I remember my favorite was an example. The example that I'm drawing from here was, I believe he was in Alaska investigating. There was this couple who were out um, fishing, and their motor hit something, and it had these like the outboard motor on their boat, there was damage to the propeller, and they thought that it had been bitten by like a very big pike or muskie or something. And there was rumors of this giant sea creature living in the waters, a possible sea monster. And of course, what it turned out to be was probably a sturgeon, because sturgeon have bony plates. Um, they have like a cartilaginous skeleton like a shark, but they have bony plates. They can get very big. Certain species can get very big. And what probably happened was this couple ran over a sturgeon. Um, so that's a good example. But yeah, like Jake, where's Thomas? Yeah, Thomas says, yeah, they had to end the show because they caught all the big fish. But he looked at all kinds of weird creatures. Like there were these giant Japanese salamanders, these giant freshwater crayfish in Tasmania that were like as big as lobsters. Stuff that I didn't know existed prior to seeing the show. But I liked that he approached these what are really anomalistic experiences um as a scientist, and I always thought he did a really good job with that. Okay, Jake says on the gumbaroo, American lumberjacks in the 19th and 20th century used the gumbaroo as an explanation for sudden forest fires. Oh, interesting. That's animism. That's our animism, right? It's a being that did that, just like gremlins causing trouble on aircraft, in the First and Second World War. Airplane doesn't work, gremlins. Well, not really, right? So that's pretty funny though. Jake says when coming into contact with fire, The gumbaroo will just explode. That's amazing. But yeah, that is, it's kind of a jokey example, but that's the animism that we were talking about when we looked at the uncanny. That's what that is. Well, I don't really have anything else for today. So if it's all the same to you, we can stop here. Um, yeah. Any questions before we go? Yeah, the name Gumbaroo, it just for some reason sounded Australian to me. Kangaroo, Gumbaroo. Like, watch out for the Gumbaroo, mate. But yeah, American. Yeah, like didgeridoo. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, now I'm going to go read about Gumbaroos and I'm going to go check out this alleged Ogopogo sighting. But if you have any questions, let me know. And I'll see you for our last lecture on Wednesday. We'll talk about satanic panic, moral panic. I will have some things, some learning materials that you'll want to look at before lecture because I'd like to make it discussion based rather than lecture based. Well, an example of how cryptid claims are not falsifiable. I mean, certainly some of them are falsifiable. Um, but of course, oh, mosquito. I mean, I don't want to characterize all of the claims that cryptozoologists make as unfalsifiable, but what they'll do in certain cases is kind of just, through their violation of Occam's razor, um, why, oh, there's not enough food to, support the existence of a large pliosaur in Loch Ness. Oh, well, clearly the creature's metabolism is such that um it doesn't need to eat that much that often. And it's like, okay, well, not only are you violating Occam's razor, but it becomes impossible to falsify anything because you just add something, some other ad hoc bit of information to your set of beliefs about this creature. And same thing with Bigfoot, right? All that, this call I heard is a Bigfoot. Well, I could come along and say, well, no, I've identified that call as a coyote. And then, again, just by making stuff up out of whole cloth, a Bigfooter might say, oh, yes, but Bigfoot can imitate the sounds of other creatures because it's very intelligent, right? So it's not that their claims, it's not like their hypotheses are not, strictly speaking, falsifiable, but they play awful fast and loose with the principle of parsimony in such a way that they kind of make it impossible to potentially falsify anything. That's what I would say about that. Does that help, Aaron? Well, I think we'll wrap it up. I'll see you all on Wednesday. So have a good rest of your day, everyone, and take care.